Circumcision is the most common surgery in America. Whether or not you choose to learn about it, it's there, directly impacting the majority of American men in the most intimate way possible.
Circumcision is the absolute, most unbelievable, disgusting attack that we could ever conceive of. Strapping an infant to a torture board, literally strapping his arms and his legs to a torture board so that all he can do is move his head, sometimes shoving a pacifier in his mouth so he's choking on his screams while you systematically jam a sharp metal instrument into his penis, sticking it in between the foreskin, which is attached to the glands, jamming it in there, and then ripping the foreskin off of the glands of the penis without anesthetic. 96% of the time, the babies are given nothing.
Many Americans have never taken the time to think deeply about circumcision. Circumcision is the surgical removal of the foreskin, the foremost part of the male penis. And in America, it is typically performed on infants within the first few days of life. No other industrialized country routinely practices non-religious infant circumcision other than America. Isn't it odd that Americans have never had a national conversation about one of the central practices of their culture, a practice which affects so many on such a personal level?
Now, so I'm arguing that it's this big thing and that we don't talk about it a lot. So I have to sort of explain why I think that. So I believe the discourse that we have in our culture about circumcision is one that's used to conceal what the nature of the process is. So you may have heard things like, well, it makes the penis cleaner or something like that. You may have heard things like, everyone does it, I'm circumcised and I'm fine. It's just a little snip, or it removes a useless flap of skin, the sort of trivializing language. You may have heard all these things. What I'm asking you to do right now is to set all that aside, all that massive experience in your minds, and to try and come at it from a fresh angle where these sort of illogical arguments or support for it are not part of where you're thinking. I'm going to propose that circumcision is this cyclical process in our culture where we do it to children, they grow up, they become adult survivors, some of those people become parents, and practitioners engage them in order to perform this surgery on their children, which, unlike any other surgery I'm aware of in U.S. hospitals, it removes a healthy, unique organ part, actually with the exception of intersex genital modification, which it bears a lot of resemblance to in my mind. It removes a healthy part of the body. It's not used as a treatment. Doctors don't think they're treating the children. They know that it's a social surgery they're performing. It has significant complications. It's performed on minors who can't give consent. It's illegal. It's actually a federal felony to perform it on girls, but it's actually encouraged to perform on boys. It results in lifelong function loss, and the tissue is then used commercially.
And so when I first Googled circumcision in 2012, the conversation has changed in 6 years. I know, because I've been paying attention. But 6 years ago, the general consensus was, between all news sources, ABC, NBC, Time, New York Times, Washington Post, Scientific American, and so on, was that circumcision was cleaner, healthier, prevented STDs and HIV, and was endorsed by the Scientific Academy, the American Academy of Pediatrics. Now, this sounded great. It created a coherent narrative in my mind. If circumcision was good for you, then of course I and all my friends were circumcised, obviously. However, I stumbled across a website that aggregated quotes about circumcision throughout all time, and something struck me about the Jewish ones. Let me show you. See if you can strike a pattern. Circumcision is a symbol of two things necessary to our well-being: the excision of sexual pleasure and to check a man's pride. 30 AD. The bodily pain is the real purpose of circumcision. One of the reasons is to bring about a decrease in sexual intercourse and a weakening of the organ. The fact that circumcision reduces sexual pleasure is undeniable. 1180 AD. Okay, well, these are ancient history. The foreskin represents man's worst animal-like urges. I like my animal-like urges. Impairment of sexual sensation is a special virtue of circumcision. 1985. Not too long before I was born. Now, these quotes didn't quite sync with the mainstream narrative. Was circumcision good for me, or did it damage my sexuality? Now remember, I was a 20-year-old male at the time. Not many things were more important to me than the health of my penis. And that still applies today.
If we go back far enough, what we find is that fathers were circumcising their children, not ritually in the Jewish style, but as a sacrifice to whatever deities they were sacrificing to at the time. As a matter of fact, some scholars have given us pretty good evidence that circumcision may have evolved as a substitute for child sacrifice. How did it become a Jewish ritual is the question. There you have to look at the Bible, the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, in which the creator of the universe appears to a 99-year-old man named Abraham, tells him that he will be able to impregnate his elderly 90-year-old wife, and that their children will give rise to a tremendous nation. However, he says, you must cut the flesh of your foreskin. What happened at first was a fairly simple removal of the front part of the foreskin and no more. It was only later that practice evolved further, first because Jewish men during the Hellenistic period wanted to perform in athletic contests naked, and they didn't want to seem to be circumcised, so they pulled the remaining foreskin back, what's now called restoration. They pulled the remaining foreskin back and clipped it actually in front so as to have a normal-looking penis again. In order to stop them from doing that, the rabbis then instituted a second phase they called priyah, which meant removing the rest of the foreskin and removing it, a much more radical procedure. It's important to understand that because the kind of circumcision that is performed in Jewish ritual is essentially identical to what is done in the United States. This very radical and very destructive kind of circumcision in which practically all of the foreskin is removed.
So, the story begins 12,000 years ago. Sigmund Freud surmised that circumcision started as a step down from child sacrifice. So instead of sacrificing the child, you would just sacrifice an essential part of him, his genitals. Now these genital blood sacrifices eventually lessened until just parts of his genitals were sacrificed, his foreskin. Now, many people erroneously believe, if you can believe it, many people erroneously believe something, but many people erroneously believe that circumcision started in the Old Testament, the Jewish Holy Book. Actually, Judaism adopted circumcision from tribes circumcising in the area. But if we take a look at the Holy Covenant in Genesis, we can see what it has to say. Every male among you who is 8 days old must be circumcised. Whether born or bought with your money, they must be circumcised. Any uncircumcised male will be cut off from his people. Now, a couple things to notice here. Every baby must be circumcised, and slaves too, because that was cool at the time. And if you weren't, you were cut off from your people, which was tantamount to a death sentence in ancient times. Now, Leonard Glick, who is a Jewish man with a medical degree and a PhD in cultural anthropology with a specialty in genital cutting, assures me that this is not even the original covenant. It was appended to the Bible in 500 BC for 2 reasons. Now, the first reason is the child is circumcised when he is a baby, so he has absolutely no choice in the matter. This forever forces him to look Jewish. Now, this promotes tribal cohesiveness, a primary objective of all tribal leaders, as they have a vested interest to maintain the social order of the tribe as they enjoy their status at the top of it. Now, the second reason is a little more interesting and plays to the underlying psychology behind genital cutting cultures. But let's use a modern-day example: fraternity hazing. Who here thinks that hazing is just a malicious exercise of power? A fair number. See, that's not exactly correct. See, hazing is an effective strategy if you want your fraternity to survive. See, hazing plays to an underlying psychological mechanism that enables group survival. See, what we do as humans is we ascribe value to the pain or suffering we endure as the price we pay to join a group or tribe. See, if you were just let into the fraternity, you could easily think, nah, and leave. However, after paying a great price in blood, sweat, tears, and body parts, you know it must be valuable. See, Judaic circumcision operates under that same psychological principle. See, ancient Judea was, and still is to a certain extent, an intensely patriarchal society. Male blood represented salvation, female blood represented filth, men ran everything. And nothing was more important to a man than his patriarchal lineage. And nothing represented his patriarchal lineage more than his son. Or even more specifically, his son's penis. So, to be accepted into this fraternity, the Jewish Brotherhood, fathers, likely younger than you, and far less educated, since this was thousands of years ago, were literally hazed into cutting off parts of their son's penis. You think college hazing is a problem? Circumcision is the most extreme form of hazing on the planet. And if you didn't do it, you were cut off from your people, which was effectively a death sentence. Yeah, we're going there. Now, Leonard Glick does a great job of summarizing circumcision in ancient Judea in his book. He says, in summary, the father offers his son's foreskin as a bloody sacrifice for what may have been a substitute for child sacrifice. He acknowledges, for what may have been he declares acknowledgement of paternity, readiness to submit the child to a perilous procedure, avowal of sexual restraint of his own and his son in the future, and intention to raise him as a conforming member of the male-centered collective, and in summary, offers his submission to the elder's will. Whoa. Do you understand what this means? See, contrary to the popular narrative, circumcision was designed to mark us like cattle. Circumcision was designed to emasculate us like slaves. Circumcision was designed to damage us like we're not even human. That is what circumcision was designed to do. And all this talk about circumcision is not even the circumcision you'd recognize today. See, Judaism underwent an overhaul around 200 AD during a diasporic period. It was called the Rabbinic period, as rabbis redid everything to accommodate the needs of a more dispersed population. Now, when rabbis were redoing everything, they redid, you guessed it, the covenant of circumcision as well. See, around 200 AD, Jews didn't want to be circumcised back then either. So, what they would do is they would take their remnant foreskin and stretch it over the head of their penis, and over a period of time, they would look uncircumcised like a Gentile. Now, this allowed Jews of ancient Greece to better fit in with their Gentile peers, as many social events were done in the nude, whether they be public spas or athletic events or whatnot. Now, undoing the Holy Covenant was anathema to rabbinic authority. So rabbis took revenge. Rabbis took revenge. And to take their revenge, they radicalized the circumcision ritual, from just cutting off the overhanging tip of the foreskin to ablation of the entire tissue. So, the new circumcision ritual, the one that stands to this day, goes like this. And it's called the Bris Milah, which means the covenant of cutting.
Circumcision became the major symbol of difference for Christians between Judaism and Christianity. This dates back to Paul's letters, Galatians, Corinthians, and others. He says specifically there that circumcision does not matter.
It was so amazing to me when I worked in the hospital. And my first question would be, I see that you're going to have the baby circumcised. And may I ask why you've chosen circumcision for your baby? And they would say, oh, because I'm a Christian. And I said, do you know that there's 120 references to circumcision in the New Testament? Circumcision is of no value. If you're a Christian, you don't live by outward signs. You live by faith expressed through love. Christ was the last to shed the blood. He was the ultimate blood sacrifice for everybody. We don't need to do this again. Oh, I didn't know that.
People are not just Christians, they are Americans, and circumcision is an American procedure.
They're practicing something because they consider they're this, without ever really understanding what that means.
The next question that we come to is, how in the world did this get to become an American custom? In Victorian England in the late 19th century, there was already well embedded the belief that masturbation was a particularly dangerous business. That loss of semen would weaken a child permanently, might give him all kinds of sickness. They said, we can stop this very dangerous habit by performing circumcision.
We know that circumcision began in England to prevent masturbation.
Masturbation was seen as this horrible thing that could cause all kinds of diseases and insanity.
And that just took hold. You know, we are a fairly prudish culture.
And it sounds crazy to us today, but in those days this was accepted.
Doctors in the 1860s and 1870s claimed that this would reduce the child's sexual sensation. But then in the 1960s it began to disappear as an idea. Can you guess why? Because the sexual revolution made having sexual pleasure permissible for the first time, basically, in American culture. And so all of a sudden, the meme, the theme that you were damaging your child sexually was no longer good advertising. So it just simply went, bing, it disappeared. And now if you talk to physicians, they will claim utterly that circumcision is not sexually damaging, that it's sexually neutral, and that there's no harm in it. And they forget entirely the medical history they have in their own occupation that claimed exactly the opposite for over 100 years.
Now, how did we get here, right? So it's become a medical practice rather than a tribal practice or a cultural practice. And that came about in the late 1800s when people had not the germ theory of disease, but the nervous excitation theory of disease. And they also had the Victorian morality. So people see what they expect to see a lot of the time. So you can find a lot of published medical literature showing that circumcision cured things like paralysis and epilepsy and hip joint disease and all sorts of problems that today seem very unlikely for the process to have cured. And people really thought that actually the intention was to harm the genitals of children. And they thought that that would help them in the long term because it would prevent them from having so much sexual excitation. That, in the Victorian model, being the most dangerous kind of nervous excitation you could have.
Hi there! Oh, I see you're circumcised. But wait, you're not Jewish or Muslim, so that's kind of strange, don't you think?
What? No, it's normal. What?
Actually, it's not. Hi, I'm Adam Conover.
I remember you.
Hey, Adam. And apart from those two religions and a few African tribes, America is actually one of the only cultures that practices circumcision. Yet, most of us don't even know why we do it. Would you like to?
Not right now, man. Oh, just get it over with.
To learn more, let's go back in time to the day you were circumcised.
God, no.
By the time your tip got snipped, circumcision had been a tradition for generations.
Would you like to circumcise Brian?
Yeah, I guess. I mean, his should look like mine, right?
Okie doke.
No! But the source of that tradition is real weird.
His should look like mine, right? His should look like mine, right? Yep, better cut him. I reckon it'll stop him from masturbating. What?
Yep. Though religious circumcision's been practiced in the Middle East for millennia, no one did it in the West until the sex-phobic days of the late 19th century, when puritanical doctors promoted it as a way to stop your kids from committing their favorite sin.
Observe the vile masturbator, the sallow complexion, the rotten teeth, and the open sores.
Actually, I think I have syphilis.
Syphilis caused by masturbation. One prominent advocate of dick docking was, and I'm not making this up, John Harvey Kellogg, the inventor of cornflakes. My cure is twofold. A diet rich in flaked corn. And cutting off part of the penis. Victorian prudes like Kellogg just straight up hated sex and thought that by pruning your Peter, they could make it less pleasurable, taming your base, lustful instincts. And, you don't even want to know what they thought you should do to women. Just apply a little carbolic acid to the clitoris. Yikes! Thank God that one didn't catch on.
Alright, everyone, let's take a ride. This is stupid. Being circumcised doesn't stop me from masturbating.
Yeah, I know. That's why it's so weird we still do it.
But isn't it cleaner or something?
No. Maybe in biblical times it helped prevent infection, but nowadays you can just wash your dingus. Circumcision has been found to somewhat reduce the risk of HIV transmission, but so do condoms, and they don't require you to chop your dick off.
Okay, but foreskins are useless.
Actually, Brian, the foreskin plays an important role in sex. It's a natural lubricant.
Contains millions of nerve endings, and it protects the glands from being desensitized.
Thanks, Bert.
Got it, bud.
But if you're uncircumcised, girls will think your dick looks weird.
Oh, it's an interesting theory. Let's test it. Does this dick look weird?
Yep.
All right, does this dick look weird?
Yep.
And does this dick look weird?
Yeah. All dicks look weird.
Thanks, man.
College Humor did a good job. A round of applause, I guess. They did a pretty good job, right? Right? See, if you watch their video on YouTube, you'll notice they include this actual disclaimer. If you're not Jewish and you're circumcised, you need to watch this video. I don't know. I'm Jewish. Seemed pretty relevant to me. See, the reason College Humor included that disclaimer is because they are scared of offending religious groups. Well, I am not. Now, to clarify, my objective isn't to offend religious groups. My objective is to tell you the truth. And if the truth offends certain groups, so be it. I refuse to be censored. And this information is too important to be censored. So, I guess the billion-dollar question is, how did we go from a Jewish blood sacrifice to a Gentile medical procedure? Seems like a stretch, right? So, as College Humor was actually spot on. See, 19th century doctors actually believed that sexual pleasure, especially masturbation, was not only evil, but the root of all physical and mental illness. And it was always well known that the foreskin was highly erogenous and facilitated masturbation, so the only reasonable course of action was to forcibly circumcise children. Now, if we take a look at the medical literature in the 19th century, here we can see a treatise on venereal diseases of the sexual system. Now, if we take a look, the author didn't even include illustrations of genitals in his textbook because he didn't want people masturbating to the pages. It looks like it may not have worked. Now again, College Humor, spot on. One of the primary advocates of dick docking was Dr. John Harvey Kellogg, the inventor of cornflakes. Surreal, isn't it? Now, Dr. John Harvey Kellogg wrote a widely read book in the 19th century titled Treatment for Self-Abuse, also known as Masturbation, and Its Effects. And in this book, he advocated using carbolic acid to burn the clitoris, training kids to chastity cages, and tying them up so they couldn't touch their genitals. He also advocated circumcision in small boys, and that it should be performed without anesthesia, so the child forever associates sexual pleasure with pain. Do you understand how sordid that is? Do you understand how sordid that is? To make things even more surreal, Sylvester Graham, the inventor of graham crackers, also advocated circumcision to prevent masturbation, claiming a masturbator becomes a confirmed and degraded idiot with livid and shriveled countenance and emaciated and dwarfish body, covered in running blisters and sores. And if we take a look at the medical literature in the 19th century, we can see what they thought an actual masturbator looked like. As you can see, it looks nothing like me. Now, I like that joke too. Now, if we were to take a representative sampling of circumcision advocates throughout the 20th century, almost all are vehemently anti-masturbation. For example, Abraham Wilburst, who didn't even have the courtesy to invent a shitty snack, claiming, circumcision is an absolute necessity for the continuing welfare of the human race. Sound like religious fanaticism to you? He also advocated the forced sterilization of any adult caught masturbating. Or Alan Guttmacher, the president of Planned Parenthood and the vice president of the American Eugenics Society, because those were hand in hand in the 1940s, claiming routine circumcision does not necessitate handling of the penis. Therefore, masturbation is considered less likely. Parents Magazine, widely read stuff. Or even in the medical literature, Campbell's Urology, a gold standard urological textbook, claiming parents are ready to adopt measures which may avert masturbation. Circumcision is usually advised on these grounds. 1970. Do you know what it means if this type of medical rhetoric was in the medical literature in the 1970s? It means that if you were circumcised in the 90s, like I was, it's very possible that our urologist learned that we should be circumcised to keep us from masturbating. Now, these Puritan attitudes are not ancient history. They affect us every single day of our lives. Now, the first stage, which used to be the only stage, is called the milai, which means cutting. And here, the ritual circumciser named the mohel will amputate the part of the foreskin that extends over the glands. If we take a look at this picture, that first dotted line is the original mila cut. And if we take a look at this picture, here's a mohel cutting into the flesh of a newborn's genitals. Now, the second stage, which was enacted as an act of rabbinic revenge, is called pariah, which means tearing. And here, the ritual circumciser will sharpen his fingernails and shred the infant's genital mucosa. If one shred of genital mucosa remained, it was deemed religiously invalid. And if we take a look at this picture, here we can see the modern-day pariah cut, where the American medical circumcision is modeled after. As we can see, it's about an amputation of a half to a third of the external genitalia. And here we can see a mohel using his sharpened fingernails to shred this infant's genital mucosa. Now, this baby doesn't look like he's having a very good time, but I could be wrong. Now, the third stage, and I'm not making this up, you can read it in the ancient rabbinic text, the Mishnah, which is still followed to this day, is called mitzitza, which means sucking. And here, the ritual circumciser, after he shreds the infant's genitals with his fingernails, will take the baby's red, raw, and bleeding penis and put it in his mouth and suck on it. Now, this is a modern-day picture of a mohel performing mitzitza on this baby. Now, if these seem like extreme acts of sexual violence to you, that is because they are, and they have real consequences. Here we have a baby who has contracted herpes after a mohel has performed mitzitza on him. Now, this baby is effectively brain dead for the rest of his life because this mohel was satisfying an ancient act of rabbinic revenge. This article is from 2017, guys. This is not ancient history. It happens today.
My last rotation, May of 1979, I witnessed a circumcision. And that's when I realized the horror of what would do to babies behind closed doors. And I'd never heard a scream like that come out of the mouth of a human being before. I started to cry, and I was standing next to the baby to comfort him. And the doctor saw me. I just couldn't control myself, and I projectile tears. And he looked at me and said, "There's no medical reason for doing this." So not only was I witnessing a torture and mutilation of a baby, I was also hearing that it wasn't necessary. And then, of course, the question is, well, why then are we doing it? But as I began to inform parents, as I became informed and informed the other nurses, the head nurse came to me one day and she said, there's somebody on the floor who's upsetting patients by talking about circumcision. And I said, well, we're all doing the education. Our job as nurses is to educate. And they said, well, we can't have you upsetting the patients, Marilyn. So in 1985, when I was fired, that's when we became a nonprofit organization. We filed a lawsuit in 1982. A little boy was circumcised. The mother didn't want it. The father did. We went to the Superior Court, and the judge then said, because circumcision is the oldest surgery known to man, and because of the court's reluctance to interfere with family life, we're going to just say that it's okay for this is a decision that's up to the parents. So nobody was ready to hear it. But I think that is how this sort of began burgeoning forth into the media and so forth. And the backlash with the show-ins and the AAP.
I got interested in circumcision in 1987 when I was asked by American Academy of Pediatrics to chair the American Academy of Pediatrics Task Force on Circumcision. The reason why they formed that task force was because the American Academy of Pediatrics had actually put its foot in its mouth in 1971. Somebody wrote a single sentence, we don't even know who wrote it, saying there are no valid medical indications for newborn circumcision.
The American Academy of Pediatrics came out firmly against circumcision and said it was unnecessary, there was no reason for it. And there was a howl of complaint from their membership, from having performed this surgery for so long and suddenly turning their back on it.
But that became the official policy of the American Academy of Pediatrics, no valid indication, and the anti-circ still go back to that all the time.
So they have a vested interest in maintaining the procedure, in not angering the 70 million American men who are circumcised, and admitting nothing.
It completely was out of line with what the function of the committee was, to show that there are indications. So that was that, until my committee.
And he went in with the same laundry list of excuses. I know he finagled his way into that position.
One of the things I said before I took the job, I says, I don't want this committee to be under the thumb of the Committee of the Fetus and Newborn, which put out the other one.
And another doctor who was on that committee at one point threw his hands up in the air and said, I'm out of here. This is undemocratic. You came in expecting to railroad a position through it.
We had one neonatologist on the committee who was very committed to the old position. And as a matter of fact, before we even had our first meeting, he said, I ain't going to change my mind.
So how do we do a circumcision? The next bits are going to be the most graphic. This is a circumcision restraint. They strap the baby down to it, and then they proceed with the procedure, which I'm going to show you a short video of. This is going to include sound, if I've hooked it up correctly. And again, you're welcome to not look at it. I find this uncomfortable. Okay, so I want to encourage you to take a deep breath if you've been having trouble breathing, like I have during that. And some things I think to notice are the sort of calm detachment of the physician's voice. So the physician is not at all distressed by this. And the way the baby's crying. I hear the babies crying as the way I hear babies cry when they're in extreme duress. Not, I'm hungry.
Currently, the benefit to risk ratio of circumcision is 14 to 1. That means there's 10 times the risk you're going to get a urinary tract infection as a baby, that you'll have a lower risk of HIV, less human papillomavirus. So when you add all those up, there's 14 benefits, some of them life-threatening.
These claims are irresponsible, and it's a scare tactic.
I don't think there's a lot of evidence for benefits. And even if there were some benefits, this is a radical solution. Major claims require major proof. When you make a major claim, and it is indeed a major claim that we doctors can improve upon the human body by removing organs, you've got to show me major proof.
Medical justification for this is a very interesting subject in itself because it shifts over the decades from one topic to another. Usually it's the disease that is most of interest at the moment that circumcision is claimed to be, quotes, good for. It began, of course, with cancer, the obvious.
Well, penile cancer is a rare disease of elderly men.
The likelihood of any particular man ever getting it in his lifetime is very slim. Those who do get it tend to be elderly and often have very poor hygienic practices, homeless men and so on. Nonetheless, the claim became popular that if we circumcise infants, we will be, quotes, protecting them from this terrible disease.
Then in the 60s, they said, now we've come to the sexual revolution, and they said, circumcision will prevent sexually transmitted diseases. Well, it didn't work. It has never worked. We have a high rate of all of them in America, as you know, where most men are circumcised, so that's ridiculous.
But just as soon as one claim disappears, the next one appears. For a while, it was urinary tract infections, UTI.
Well, girls get UTIs. What do we do for them? We give them antibiotics. We don't chop off parts of their bodies.
Once again, this is an uncommon condition. It occurs primarily in children who have other defects. It occurs in girls more than in boys. It is readily treatable by antibiotics within a day or two.
These are just the excuses. And every excuse, when one excuse is debunked, the next one comes along.
It's almost like there's a disease of the decade.
Name a decade, and there was some fear at work. Guess what the latest fear is these days? HIV.
So the only way to figure out whether, in this case, male circumcision was going to protect men was to do a randomized trial.
In this randomized trial, we identified HIV uninfected men, then we randomized them to either get circumcised immediately or delay circumcision for 2 years, and found that circumcised men had 60% lower infection rates. Those studies have really gotten legs. I mean, they were picked up in the popular press.
Those studies are the reason why the American Academy of Pediatrics released their 2012 circumcision policy statement.
It's the Circumcision to Prevent AIDS agenda with big, big bucks behind it.
If you're circumcised, your chance of AIDS is reduced by over 60%.
PEPFAR will provide $40 million to support circumcisions for almost 500,000 of boys and men.
All three of those studies have been contested for their statistical shortcuts.
So here's the results. The number of men who were circumcised who got infected after 12 months was 1.5% of the groups. And I've combined the stats to make it easy, but the studies were very similar. The intact, that is the men who were not circumcised, their infection rate was higher, 3.38% of the group. So the absolute risk reduction you could argue for circumcision is 1.8%. And this is the stat you should be reading in your newspaper, not the 53%, because that's the relative risk reduction comparing the two little groups. So one of the commonest errors in statistics is for people to jack up their results by talking about relative changes and not talking about absolute changes. All right, let's go through the flaws. Flaw 5, selection bias. Only men interested in male circumcision were included, and so that automatically excludes others who might have been at lower risk because of behavior. Number 6, they were well paid. Mostly were unemployed, and frankly, the young men were desperate, and this way they would get cash, they'd get a free circumcision, and they get free health care for a year or two, which in the U.S. would be like giving you $12,000. So just the very structure of these studies makes them unethical in the U.S. The next problem is that for every participant infected, a huge number were lost. I mean, at the highest, 7.4 for every individual that was involved was lost. You have to wonder what would have happened had those people stayed in the study. Small differentials in the loss group could negate these findings too. And all of these flaws are cumulative. The more flaws you have in the study, the more the results of the study, especially when they're small, are called into question. Flaw 13. Are you getting saturated on the flaws here? Have I convinced you?
It's worth noting in relation to this, continental Europeans have never practiced circumcision to any significant degree. And yet, their health statistics, including their HIV statistics, are usually much better than ours.
We have the highest rates of HIV among any industrialized country. How can anybody sane think that the country with the highest circumcision rate and the highest HIV rate is going to stop HIV by circumcision? It's lunacy. We predicted that eventually, after a few years, they were going to try to translate these studies over and make them applicable in North America. And sure enough, that's what they did.
I think it definitely has implications in America. So it really is a shame that the rates of the procedure have really declined in newborns in this country.
To do something like that to advance your own career on the backs of babies, that is evil. I consider that evil.
They've gone from voluntary circumcision for men to semi-voluntary circumcision for young men to involuntary circumcision for infants, which is Plan C and was, I think, the plan all along.
Leaving aside the human rights issues, there was a study that found, to their surprise, that female genital cutting might possibly help in the fight against HIV. Well, surprisingly, I'm being sarcastic here, surprisingly, no one is proposing female circumcision be done to stop HIV. Well, no one should be proposing the male circumcision be done for that reason either.
Here are the contra studies, including 3 by the authors of the African RCTs. Studies, in other words, that show that the effect is not as good as you would hope.
So I don't really have any regard at all for the HIV claims. I find them distracting and spurious and a waste of time.
So, beyond the pain of the procedure itself and the pain of the many days it takes to heal, there are a number of complications that a circumcision procedure puts a child at risk for. You can sort of divide them into 2 categories. Surgical complications, which go from the more minor, everyone has a scar who's been circumcised. A lot of men don't actually know that the ring around their penis is the circumcision scar, or they learn it when they hear my talk. But that always happens. But a number of other complications can be problematic that don't occur all the time, like penile adhesions, when the healing process goes awry and two parts of the penis that weren't supposed to be connected link together. And then these panels show in the top left A, that's called a fistula. So it's like a doctor-induced hypospadias. The black line going down is a probe that's entering the meatus, the opening of the urethra, and exiting out the additional hole that the physician has caused. And B is a nearly amputated head of the penis. C, so much skin of the penis was removed that the child's corpus cavernosa and head of the penis are lodged down inside the scrotum. And in D, the penis was accidentally amputated entirely. There are also a number of postoperative complications, ranging from difficulty breastfeeding, which is important because breastfeeding is developing the ability to breastfeed is very important for children. Bleeding, which is another sort of minimizing term. You see that on consent forms, and you're like, oh, bleeding. Well, it turns out an infant has 12 ounces of blood. So bleeding a couple ounces may actually cause that child to die or need a blood transfusion. Increase in pain response, infection, which is also very serious for a newborn, myotitis, which is an irritation of the opening, and that also can be problematic because if it gets bad enough, the child won't be able to pee, and that'll cause you to need catheterization. Necrosis, and even permanent loss of the penis or death. I talked with a pediatric urologist. Those are the people who get the complications to deal with. And he said in a 2-year period, he had over 275 kids he had to treat, almost half of whom required surgery. So they were subjected to an additional surgery in order to attempt to correct whatever had happened.
You know, you have a little boy, he's circumcised, but he's expected to get what he wants without hitting or without hurting or manipulating other people. So there comes a time when he's going to realize that part of his body was forcibly removed. And he may have any number of reactions to that reality, but subconsciously, the truth is, it's allowable for someone who is bigger than you to hold you down and do what they want to your body because it fit their opinion of what was okay to do. And so you have a real disconnect between the concept of equality and the reality, and I just don't think that it's possible for us to grow with that poison sitting there. If we want to be a real free people like we claim that we are, we can't do that and have that underlying lesson taught at our most vulnerable time.
As time goes by, it goes from just the knowledge that it's not something for my kids to moving into the activism. And then the more you know about things, the more you want to stop them. Are we cool? Sorry. I think it's important to come with the kids, too. I know there are people that say the signs are graphic, the kids shouldn't see that. But it's real, and it happens. And hiding it from them, what's the point of that? My son is not even 4. He knows it's wrong. He knows that it hurts the babies to do that. He gets it.
Don't think we don't cut baby penises off. Yeah, because that's not nice.
I think we don't cut penises off because that's not nice. And this is the stuff that he says. We see the signs, Mommy, why is that baby crying? Well, it's sad. Well, what's happening? And we explain that doctors tie him down and they cut off part of his penis and it hurts him a lot. And he'll say to me, it's mean. They shouldn't be allowed to do that. And he gets it. It hurts a woman to know that the man you love or a man you want to love or your father or you know, your best friend growing up, that someone hurt him in the worst way they could and that nobody cared. And there are a lot of nights where I will sit up until 2 in the morning reading and trying to get my mind off of things, and I can't, and I'm crying for my brothers, and I'm crying for my father, and for all the boys that nobody cares to save, all the boys that, you know, if somebody would have just said, have you thought about this, or if a doctor wouldn't have been, you know, a complete asshole and convinced a mother that she had to mutilate her son because it's necessary for whatever reason, I don't know. I don't know how you can know this exists in the world and not want to stop it. In all of my flaws and all of my failings, I know that at least I didn't do that to them. I can't imagine, I don't know, I can't imagine the regret of knowing that you did that to your son and then learning that it was wrong.
It's time for our culture to stop being complacent about circumcision. It's time to go out and be part of that ethical correction. So, thank you very much.
Well, we went into the doctor. She did this circumcision, and his penis was fine before that. I heard him scream, which was horrible. So I tried to get in there, but they had locked the door. And once she allowed me to go in, she said that he had a concealed penis. Well, what I didn't know until recently is that it was a botched circumcision. I had told her that he looked normal before. And she just said that basically I didn't know what I was talking about because she does this every day.
At what point did you start to realize that this was something the doctor had done rather than something he was born with?
Yesterday. I knew something was wrong all along, but I knew yesterday. When I was watching the speakers during Marilyn, she was showing these slides. I saw my son's penis on there, concealed penis, and she said that it was a botched circumcision.
What happens here is either the doctor has removed too much tissue of the foreskin.
And that's when I realized what had happened, and it was a really hard day for me. I haven't had a day that hard in a long time. I realized that I did something to my son I shouldn't have done. Some men feel like it is as bad as being raped. How could I have done that to my son? What if he feels that way one day? I didn't have the right to do that to him. And I didn't know until I went to the No Circ conference yesterday.
Yes, some of these are disturbing, but until we really see what circumcision is and its impact upon humans, while these things may not happen very often, if it's you, it's significant.
There's not a single state in the U.S. that requires outpatient circumcision reporting, and no doctor is required to report a botch. And I talk to pediatricians all the time who say, I see 2-3 botches a week, but what can I do?
John, you're mentioning no way to track what goes on in the outpatient. There's no way to track what goes on in the inpatient either because nobody's keeping statistics. There is no nationalized system for tracking adverse events after circumcision. So we don't really know how many babies die or need antibiotics or blood transfusions or what we don't know.
Yeah, I was just going to add that
I'm going to educate myself more, and I'm going to be an intactivist. I'm going to put the information out there. I'm going to do what I can to make sure that other women and other men don't do this to their children. Hopefully, in educating other people, I can stop this from happening to anyone else. At least some people, I feel violated.
I also want to give a voice to the ways that parents are ethically violated by circumcision. It was assault on him, and on some level, it was an assault on me. I will go to my grave hearing that horrible wail. If only once someone had mentioned that it wasn't medically necessary, I know I would have questioned it, but no one did.
If I would have known before that scream that it would have hurt him, I wouldn't have done it. But she told me he wasn't going to feel anything. She totally lied to me. I've always been talking to doctors about it, but nobody ever told me that it was something that happened because of a botched circumcision until yesterday. I talked to Katya, and she's the first person that told me that's not normal. They give me no information.
Yeah. And I mean, a lot of the people that I approach and I start talking to at like 20 weeks, they don't even know that that's like something that's not necessary, that's cosmetic, that there are repercussions or anything.
Did Katya know before the conference yesterday?
Yes. Maybe that's why she asked me to go.
parents should know that these accidents are extremely common. When I did a case for a young man who had had too much shaft skin removed and too much inner foreskin lining left, which resulted in a repair where there's sort of a bulge in the middle of the penis. It's so rather unsightly. His own doctor volunteered to the defense a video in which he said, well, this isn't malpractice. I repair one of these a week. Well, of course, that does not follow. Merely because he repairs one a week doesn't mean it's not malpractice. What it means is there's a lot of malpractice.
Of course, the American Academy of Pediatrics claims that the circumcision complication rate is under 2%. Well, let's think about this for a second, just as non-medical people. Who determines where the complications occur and when they occur? And the answer is the hospital, right? The kid gets circumcised on Monday and maybe has complications on Tuesday. But if they send him home Wednesday, the hospital never hears about the complications.
There are lots of botched circumcisions, or the complaints of adult men. Why do I have skin bridges? Why do I have hunks and slices missing? Why do I have a curvature? Why do I have tight erections, painful erections, tearing at the scar site?
Unfortunately, for those of us who have been circumcised, we'll never know what our penis was meant to look like. The penis you have now is a man-made penis. Somebody cut into it, and they arbitrarily decided how much of your penis they would take. And so now your penis looks like what they thought it should look like, which has varying results. You know, a lot of the time there's that phenomena some people have called Boner's arc, where their penis is bent to one side or the other. I would say 9 times out of 10, if you look, the scar tissue behind the head of your penis, say if your penis is bent to the left a little bit, you'll notice that the scar is wider on the left, where they've taken so much skin that there's actually enough tension there that it causes your penis to obtain that bend over time.
Nobody has ever assembled all the complications of circumcision, including the adult fallout, especially adult fallout, ever. If you talk to an honest pediatrician about the number of damaged boys he sees in a month, you'd be astonished.
We did 1,600 circumcision revisions. Many times the lowest person on the totem pole was asked to do it. You've probably heard the old expression, see one, do one, teach one, which is often used in residency programs. And sadly, that often happens.
These are some of the instruments that are used. This is a Shelton clamp. This company has just been put out of business because it's injured too many babies. This is the foreskin in a Shelton clamp. This clamp has caused the amputation of the glands or parts of the glands, but imagine that. Being clamped onto a penis, onto a foreskin. It's here. This is a Gomco clamp, and it's thousands of pounds of pressure is put on. So this is the screw that goes down. They bring the baby's foreskin up through this, and then they start screwing it down, and that tightens this clamp. So the foreskin is being crushed. There, the rest of his penis is down here. But imagine that on a baby's penis. Does that look like a piece of equipment that should be on a baby's penis? And here it is for an adult.
Let's go into the Mogan clamp.
Myself and John Giuliano of East Northport, New York, obtained a $1 million judgment against Mogan circumcision instruments. It involved a ritual circumcision by a Jewish mohel, and the mohel did not appreciate that you can entrap the glans penis in the jaws of the Mogan clamp. He did just that. And when the child continued to bleed, an other doctor who was present noticed it. Mogan Circumcision Instruments, whom we had sued, did not answer the lawsuit, and they never showed up at any hearing. Are there Mogan clamps being used today in hospitals throughout the country? Absolutely. And frankly, I believe the design of the Mogan clamp is extremely dangerous.
I want to address briefly something called the Plasti-Belt. The doctor's asked to tie off that extra skin, and then because it's tied off, it supposedly loses its blood supply and sloughs away. And if for any reason that knot is not tied perfectly tightly, it's a source of infection. The fact that a child can die from this means I don't think that thing should be on the market.
This issue is very personal to me because I was a victim of MGM. My mother did it because that's what everybody did at the time. So most people, I think, go into it thinking that, oh, it's not a big deal. It's just something everybody does. And they feel like it's just something they have to do. And they really don't realize how they're harming their child, I think, at the time that they do it. I think most people get a sense, some sort of sense that they are hurting their child, but they think that it's necessary. And that's very concerning to me, because if people, the way I see it, there's 4 main reasons why male genital mutilation still happens. One is conformity. They want to be just like everybody else. Another is ignorance. They don't know why the foreskin is valuable. They don't know how cutting the penis of their boy harms him. Another is religious reasons. And another is profit, because a lot of hospitals, doctors make lots and lots of money from doing this surgery. It's the most common surgery performed in the U.S. I'm still angry about it, don't get me wrong, and I don't think that's ever going to change. I'm damaged for life, but after a while you just kind of have to accept that there's not much I can do about that. All I can do is help save other people from being mutilated like I was. I've heard every argument. I'm kind of numb to it, because it's always the same thing over and over, same excuses for why they cut their children. You just kind of learn how to live with that. It's also been great that the intactivist community is growing. There's more and more of us out here every single day, and it's great that we can be out here together and support each other. Because I feel like there's a lot of men out there who have been hurt by this issue, but they're afraid to speak up about it. Because most of the time, if they do speak up, they'll be ridiculed by people. People they don't give them a counter argument or anything, they just ridicule and bully them. It's not just physical damage. The physical damage is undeniable, don't get me wrong, and that's not going to go away, but there's also emotional damage. There's also a sense of betrayal. So this is another reason, by the way, why I think it's so hard for a lot of mutilated men to come to terms with the fact that they were damaged, because no man wants to really think of his penis as damaged. He wants to think it's the best penis in the world, right? And it can do what it's supposed to. But the truth is we are damaged, and that's a hard thing for a lot of men to accept. And it's also hard for a lot of men to accept that their parents, their own parents who were supposed to protect them, gave consent for them to be cut.
One group is starting a conversation about circumcision in America.
Intactivism is a social movement of people who believe that all children have a right to keep the genitals they were born with. Cutting any part of their genitals off is a violation of human rights.
And there are activists all over the world that understand our message that boys and girls are born with a body that is their right to keep.
They feel that that boy's right to decide for himself is more important than the parent's right to decide what's best for him.
It's a very powerful, compelling topic. For one thing, if you've acquiesced to having your child circumcised, and then you hear later that it might not have been the right thing, that's a mortifying feeling. It's a feeling either that overwhelms you with embarrassment or grief or rage, or it's one that you want to dismiss. But it's not a neutral thing. It's never a neutral thing for a parent.
Is there any parts removed, or is it just an incision?
The 5 most sensitive parts of the penis are removed during surgery.
Wow. Well, I'll read up on that. I didn't know. I thought it was just an incision. I had no idea they actually removed tissue.
It's very harmful because it's done to the baby without their permission.
You guys know that it's hygienic, right? You do know that, right?
It's not. I mean, you think we just came here and set up a demonstration without knowing what anything about it?
You know it is hygienic.
You know, women have foreskin as well, right? They have full skin.
That's totally different.
And we have vaginas with lots
That's
of folds.
totally different. Now, why? Because they have sensitive nerve endings.
So
and it's very...
If you're a circumcised man, it's a potentially awful thing to think about. Okay, I was tied down when I was a baby and somebody cut part of my body off. That's not so great, but I don't remember it. Maybe oh, you know what, I'm fine. And all of this stuff comes into play, and I don't think you can just walk away from feelings like that.
I've been around a lot of social movements, but the one thing that's unique about the genital integrity movement is that it's all tragedy through and through. Something horrible happened to all of them to bring them here. Nobody came here feeling good about circumcision and then got involved. It's because something's happened to them or something's happened to somebody that they care about that's ruined their life. And I don't think that's too strong of a phrase either. Circumcision fundamentally changes you forever.
If I met a couple who was thinking about circumcising their child, I would try to approach them in a not as much of a non-adversarial way as possible, so that they're more inclined to listen, and just tell them what the foreskin is useful for. I think most people, they don't even know that the foreskin is useful. They don't know that it has the highest concentration of nerve endings in the whole penis. They don't know that it glides back and forth during intercourse to make penetration smoother. It's actually, most women say they experience less pain or they're less sore after sex with an intact man than a circumcised man. So I would just try to make them aware of those things, and also, if possible, show them the surgery, because a lot of people, they don't see what's being done. When I've said this before, for the first moment that I saw the surgery, I saw a video of circumcision being done to an infant, I knew immediately this was wrong, because it's bloody, the baby's crying his eyes out, they have him restrained to a circumstraint, and it's blatantly obvious, I think, to anybody with a little bit of empathy to look at that and say, oh, maybe we shouldn't do this to our child. That's pretty barbaric.
When my mother took me and we were walking into this home, this long and dark hallway, it was the strangest feeling I had. It's like I felt chills all over my body, I felt cold. And I knew something bad was going to happen. And when I asked my mother where she was taking me, and she said, yeah, I'm getting you a gift, and it's time to become a woman. And then I saw a young girl who was being taken out of one of the rooms. Maybe she was 7, I'm not sure, who couldn't even cry because her voice was stuck inside. And that's I knew. I just knew that I'm going to be one of those girls. In Europe, I was like, never happened to all these women, no. So I started investigating and realizing that we have to speak against it. So I felt like I have to use my own private pain, my own wound, to heal others. Meryl and I became friends, and she said, you should come to my house. So I came here to her house, and she showed me a video. Young boy who was having the circumcision done. She didn't say anything, she just put that tape on. Same thing I saw myself, the way they tied her wrists and legs, tiny, on that table. And the cry. I was there already when I was walking to that hallway, sitting and laying down on that table. That pain, it was me crying. And then when I saw what he was doing, the doctor, how he was pushing things up and cutting the foreskin, I lost it. I just was like, this is mutilation. How can in America we keep fighting about the rights of girls and we're not saying anything about this? I don't like anyone hurting a child, so I'm against both male and female. I am a human rights worker, an activist. That means all rights of children. I cannot select one side and say, I don't hear your cry.
So this is the section on the child. The procedure for the child, we'll run through what the procedure looks like. That's probably the most graphic section, along with the complications. And what I want you to think about is, it's oftentimes talked about from the parent's perspective. Parents have a right to choose. I want you to question that discourse and think about, what's the child's point of view? Who owns the child's body? What rights do they have? Why are we doing it to boys and not girls? What's that say about our view of gender? And so on. So, this slide shows 3 different representations of people in the genital cutting process. The top left is a young girl being circumcised in a culturally, in her cultural scenario. The top right is a young boy being circumcised in his cultural scenario. And the bottom right is a young infant boy in a hospital in the US. And what I want you to do is look at their faces. Just look at their faces, because I'm asking you to think about their experience. And to me, it looks like they're having a very similar experience. And yet, in our culture, I see us as being kind of imperialist. We're very ready to point the finger and say, oh, these terrible things these people do in these other countries where they practice female genital cutting. We're silent about the male genital cutting that occurs to children under the same conditions of hygiene and the same death rates in those countries. And we promote doing it to boys in this country. So I ask people, how do they know that female genital cutting is so awful and male genital cutting is so fine? And they don't have any answer. It's not like they've actually gone and talked to someone who had experienced female genital cutting. They just, in their gut, feel that female genital cutting is terrible and male genital cutting is fine. And I propose that that is due to our socialization around gender, that we actually think male bodies are more expendable and more harmable and female bodies are more to be nurtured and protected. And it has to do with our imperialism and our racism. So we are very willing to point fingers at people of other ethnicities and of other countries of origin and other cultural practices, and not as willing to look at ourselves really carefully.
It's okay to talk about African culture and barbarism and mutilation, but this is America. We can't talk about, hurting our young boys.
For me, it's not an issue of competitive suffering. Everybody's hurt. It's the first cut. After that, it just gets worse. But it's the first cut of my cutting into your body that is the human rights violation.
The torture, for me, is the same. That first cut is the same thing. When they cut the child, they cut forever her mind. Same thing with the boys.
Where is human rights violation? Do you have to cut off this much of my finger or this much, or is it my whole hand that makes it a human rights violation? No, it's the first cut where my freedom ends where your body begins. So simple as that.
Everything that America does, even some people hate it, they will do what America does. So I said, if we pass laws in this country and say hurting young girls this way is an abuse, then the Africans will think about, oh my God, yeah, I should stop this. I went to every politician I could. I would speak everywhere. And in '96 we passed it. It took 9 years.
There have been a lot of studies on circumcision. Quite a few of them have studied the pain. Until the mid-'80s, medical doctors generally believed that newborn infants did not feel pain. They were actually doing abdominal surgery on infants as old as 15 months without anesthesia. And then what happened was some parents learned about this and complained about it.
A woman on the East Coast had a baby who had open heart surgery without an anesthetic. The mother got in touch with Anand and Hickey, and Anand then did this work. The idea was, do babies feel pain, and could they document whether they did or not? Of course, they did, and it turned out that the younger the baby, the more exquisitely the pain is felt.
When that result was published in 1987, it was concluded that, yes, newborn infants can feel pain. I mean, what's amazing about this, again, the baby's crying, but medical doctors are not sensitive to nonverbal responses to pain.
It took the American Academy of Pediatrics years for them to acknowledge the pain in babies. About 50% of boys are being anesthetized. That was the latest figure I heard.
Previously, it was thought babies don't feel pain. We don't have to use local anesthesia. Even they scream, but they scream if they're wet, if they're hungry, and so on like that, and they get over it very quickly. So, but now it's standard procedure.
The anesthesia is not always effective, and it doesn't eliminate all the pain.
The topical is the least effective, and the ring block, when it works, is the most effective, but it takes 4 injections into the penis, which hurts.
The procedure is painless. I mean, nowadays, if you see somebody that's has done quite a few, Very often the baby sleeps through the procedure.
Well, sometimes infants appear to be sleeping through a circumcision, and that's an interpretation of adults. What's actually happening is the baby is withdrawing and a traumatic shock. This is the only thing they can do. They can't escape physically, so they'll escape psychologically. The idea that infants don't remember pain is another one of those cultural myths.
Yes, the pain can be remembered. There's a study by Taddeo many years ago who looked at the response to immunization.
One group of these babies being vaccinated responded so dramatically to pain, they said, what the heck is this about? And they went to see, you know, what were the differences? Were they breastfed versus bottle fed? Were they held more? No, it was the boys who'd been circumcised that responded hysterically to the vaccination or responded much more dramatically to the pain.
And the investigators explain this by saying this is a result of neurological effects from the circumcision and a symptom of post-traumatic stress disorder.
When we were taping the circumcision at the hospital, suddenly the light was on that baby's penis, and the nurse was scrubbing. So the baby gets an erection. That's the first thing that happens. The baby gets there. This is the baby's first shared sexual experience. Having been sexually abused as a child, the feeling in my stomach was the same as it had been as a sexually abused child, and I thought, this is sexual abuse. That was when I got it. And then to hear the scream, and I thought, oh my God, not only is this child abuse, it's and sexual abuse, it's violence. So it's where sex and violence meet for the first time. And every sexual experience is on that neuronal background of pain.
By repressing those early powerful feelings, we make it more difficult to experience and express any feeling, because defenses don't work that way. They work generally. I view this not just as a symptom of circumcised men, but it's also a cultural symptom, because culturally we tend to avoid information about circumcision. I asked a group of men, please estimate the size in square inches of an adult foreskin. I got a range of responses from 1/2 square inch up to maybe about 6 or 8 square inches. The men who tended to minimize the area of the adult foreskin tended to be the ones who felt more okay about being circumcised. The actual area of the adult foreskin may be 12 square inches or even more. If men don't recognize the harm that's done to them, they're likely to say, hey, I'm okay. There's also a psychological motivation here, and that is how men feel about their sexual anatomy is critical to their self-esteem.
One of the main reasons people are reluctant to discuss it is that people don't want to be seen as weak or damaged, but that's what circumcision does, is it damages the penis. It's an assault on the sexuality of men. And I struggled with it. I struggled with it for many years. I went through a period of denial. I didn't want to accept that, you know, that what happened to me was significant. I had to go through a period of grieving. I mean, it's a loss. It's not just a loss of skin or, you know, a part of the penis. It's a loss of trust. You grow up feeling like those who were there to protect you didn't. Those who were there to look out for your best interests didn't. And it kind of makes you question, at least for me, who can you trust?
Distrust is a potential post-traumatic stress disorder symptom among circumcised men who are aware of the harm of their circumcision.
All of the men who've talked to me have told me, well, almost all of them, have told me that they don't want to talk to anyone else about it because they're afraid of how harsh people's reactions will be to that. If you are willing to accept a man's feelings about circumcision then as valid, then you have to question circumcision. So if you're not willing to question circumcision, then you have to trivialize the feelings of the survivor.
I hear from men who are extremely angry about having been circumcised.
Feeling alone because everyone else thinks it's fine, but they think it's not fine.
I hear from men who feel a lot of grief.
Feeling like there's this sexism that's hurt them that no one notices.
Men ask, you know, Why was this forced on me? I mean, it's my body, it should be my choice.
I've talked with a few men who even say they feel like they have some kind of flashback-like phenomena where they have these dreams occasionally that are violent dreams where somebody's holding them down. And, you know, so some men have a real lot of things that they're working through, and they're working through them a lot more alone than I wish they would be because of society's lack of concern for them.
I found out the hard way. I got circumcised at an older age. I mean, it wasn't botched, it was just regular circumcision. It was like losing your eyesight, losing, you know, like being able to, like eating food and not being able to taste food anymore. And the doctor, you know, I called him up and told him, you know, how upset I was, you know, that this is, and he goes, oh, you know, it's usually not like that. It's, you know, it's you. And he goes, I got to go. I have patience. And he hung up on me. So he was very dismissive with me. And then he sent, it's funny, he sent something in the mail saying that the whole thing was paid for. When I didn't pay for the whole thing, so I think he was scared. They'll say, there's no other guys complain. But when the guys do complain, they'll say, oh, you're exaggerating. So this is like a no-win situation. I got into deep depression and stuff, but I realized I had to help myself because a lot of people wants to minimize the trauma, because it is trauma. Even I was scared to talk about it first because I you know, you get a very hostile reaction. And I'm like, oh, you did that to yourself, or, you know, get over it. It's like, no, I'm speaking against it because I didn't know better then, and now I know.
The main reason parents say that they select a circumcision for their child is something to do with appearance, because they want their child to look like their dad, because they want their child to look like their children's peers, or because they think a circumcised penis looks better. All of those I really wish would drive a chill down our spines, thinking like, is this what we want to be doing as parents? The idea that parents have a right to mold their children's appearance such that it suits them, I think is a really frightening idea. And I don't want our society to move in that direction. Your child may come back to you 18 years later and say, like, Mom, Dad, you chose to have a part of my body removed that I want.
I knew I needed to confront my parents. It was something that didn't seem right, and it was something that was already done to me. 3 days after I had read all this about it, my mom was laying down in the living room, and, you know, my lip was kind of quivering. I was really nervous because I was already fairly upset about this. I'd said, well, I found out what circumcision was, and I said, well, why was it done to me? And she'd kind of talked in circles about it was a cosmetic thing, it was parental preference, claims that parents own their children, and I do remember this word for word, used the term, you are mine. It was really frustrating to hear that. It's obviously, I think it's kind of frustrating for anyone to be told by someone else, hey, I own you. And I just tried to say, but I don't like it, and it's, you know, it was my body that was affected. And she didn't take that well either. It ended up turning into a screaming match where she had gotten up and knocked over a bunch of cups on the table and, you know, kicked them in my direction. And I was on the couch crying, and I was trying to form words to explain to her how upset and how sad I was. But she was feeling the exact same way towards me. This was the spark that started the terrible relationship we have now.
Like I said, I've talked with hundreds of parents also, especially doing all this work that I do with parents. I've talked with many who, when they receive their child back, that's the moment at which they understand what they had signed up for. And so there's a problem with informed consent, both that the information is lacking and that parents are sometimes asked about it at an inconvenient moment, like such as when they're in labor, you know. And they're also asked about it in this sort of values-neutral way. It's like, you know, would you like a pillow? Would you like a cup of tea? Would you like your child circumcised? You know, it carries the same sort of tone, you know. And I'm concerned about that. So I view us as having this sort of manufacturing pseudo-informed consent process where parents need to trust physicians. They're the people who are, the physicians are supposedly the ones who are bringing in the discipline of medicine. And so they come in, but they're given this information that is very cursory. It lacks real information about the complications. Those are trivialized. The foreskin functions are completely omitted. It's not mentioned that it's actually a sexual organ. And the ethical questions of making decisions about your children's bodies are omitted. And there's also this undeclared conflict of interest. There's really a lot of commercial use of the tissue. So the other thing parents don't know is that it's painful for a week or longer afterwards. So the baby's not only in pain during the process, but this wound has to heal. It's a wound on the penis, and babies are very sensitive to pain. How many people have gotten to play with a baby who is newly, you had a friend who had a baby, or you had a baby a few days old? They're very fragile beings. And so what we've done is we've put this wound on this child, and now this new parent who's dealing with the healing process, the process of figuring out what it's like to have this new baby, also has this added complication. They have to watch for signs of infection. They have to keep changing the bandage, and their baby's more upset than he would have been. In comparison, if the child's not circumcised, all you have to do is, almost nothing. In fact, you don't even wash the penis. Just like you wouldn't wash your baby's vagina with soap, you just rinse it. You don't retract it. It becomes retractile on its own. And you have a baby with fewer health problems and who is more content. So how do we make physicians into that? Well, first we start by pathologizing a healthy organ. Not only is the foreskin absent from most U.S. medical and anatomy texts, there's therefore no education about the functions. It's not spoken of as a sexually important organ. Physicians are only taught how to remove it as a procedure, and they're mistaught care. They're mistaught this retract and wash philosophy, which is problematic because, as you can see down at the bottom, the foreskin, when you're born, is usually attached to the head of the penis. What you saw early in the circumcision video was the physician running this tool around to scrape the foreskin loose so they could cut it off. It's bonded like that to protect babies from, all the sorts of things that babies do. They might have feces or urine in their diaper. They might get scratched up. So the foreskin has this protective function when you're young. Gradually that detaches and the foreskin becomes retractile, but if you forcibly retract it, that tears it up and creates a site for infection. Also, if you wash with soap, that creates a site for infection. And finally, we make this misdiagnosis called phimosis. There's a true problem called phimosis, which is when there's scar tissue at the opening of the foreskin so it can't retract. And there are treatments for it using steroidal cream to help the scar tissue soften. But when we think that a baby who's 3 weeks old has phimosis because you can't pull the foreskin back without making the baby scream, that's wrong. It's actually meant to be attached that way. It grew that way, and it will become retractile on its own.
I was one of 4 physicians that performed a touch-sensitive test on volunteer males.
We did a sensitivity study. They can determine how responsive certain body parts are by using these monofilaments. The monofilaments are calibrated to bend at a certain pressure, so your results are absolutely accurate and they're repeatable.
And we proved that the most sensitive part of the male penis was the foreskin, and in men who had been circumcised, the most sensitive part was at the site of the circumcision scar. This was published in the British Journal of Urology. The lead author's name was Maurice Sorrells.
The Sorrells study showed a 75% loss of fine touch sensation in the circumcised male compared with the intact male.
And the findings of our study showed that the most sensitive part of the penis is ablated with circumcision. Duh. The foreskin and the frenulum and the frenular delta are the most sensitive parts of the male penis.
In the Journal of British Urology, they did just that. They studied the sensitivity differences between the circumcised and the uncircumcised penis. Now, if we take a look at their findings, with red and purple being the most sensitive, what we can see is the most sensitive part of a circumcised penis, the red, is along the circumcision scar line, the red and purple. Whereas the least sensitive part, fun fact, is the glands, the yellow and green. Now, if we contrast that with the uncircumcised, or more appropriately named intact penis, what we can see is the most erogenous part of the intact penis is the entirety of the foreskin, which is entirely consistent with the historical knowledge that the foreskin was the most erogenous part of the penis, which is exactly why they cut it off. Now, if you contrast that again with the circumcised penis, the most erogenous part of the circumcised penis is the scar of where the foreskin was amputated. Now, when I've spoken with friends who've been circumcised in adulthood, they've said sex without a foreskin is the difference between night and day, the difference between black and white and color. which makes sense because most of your nerve endings were in your foreskin. So, if you were circumcised at birth, you were like me before I got glasses. You may unwittingly assume that's what everyone else sees or feels. But you have no idea what your penis is capable of because you've never had the sensory tissue necessary to feel the sensations you're supposed to. Now, this sensory deficit has always been known and praised by circumcision advocates, despite fierce opposition from both inside and outside of religious ideologies. For example, European Dr. C.J. Fallier advances the astute argument in the medical literature: the sensory pleasure induced by the foreskin is lost by circumcision. The fundamental biological act becomes, for the circumcised male, the satisfaction of an urge and not the refined sensory experience it was meant to be. Now, this is a profound loss. This is a profound loss. It is a loss of your humanity, is what it is.
So what is the foreskin? The foreskin is this sort of socially constructed thing. It's really just a part of the penis, but since we cut it off, now we need to give it a separate name. In fact, a lot of potential complications lists that you get on your informed consent form say that one of the risks is that you might injure the penis. So we've actually constructed a reality or a view of reality in which cutting off part of the penis is not injuring it. It's only if you then cut the part that you had intended to leave that it's an injury. So I want to show you what the foreskin is. I want to spend some time on that. The foreskin in an adult male is the part that would have been removed is about 12 to 15 square inches. It's the size of a 3x5 index card. It is the most erogenous part of a human male. It contains 10 to 20,000 fine touch nerve endings, and it also makes the penis shaft skin motile. So it's the difference when you're having intercourse or some kind of sexual interaction. It's the difference between this kind of interaction and something like, if you can imagine a part of your body where the skin moves around nicely. My cheeks are floppy, so I can do that. And that's actually a significant thing because there's another kind of nerve called a stretch receptor that gets stimulated during that motion, and it's the male's contribution to mechanical lubrication during intercourse. Either male-male or male-female. The foreskin can be broken down in a couple specialized areas. The frenulum is this sort of, my hand isn't really long enough, but it's this fanning out region here, and then there's the ridge band below it. That's where most of the nerves land. And the dartos muscle is a cutaneous muscle that allows the foreskin to respond to cold or fear by surrounding the penis and pulling it in towards the body. In 2007, the first research ever was done to attempt to assess where the penis is sensitive. And they took a group of males who were intact and a group of males who were circumcised. And what you see on this colored graph here, the most sensitive regions are that sort of maroon color, and the second most sensitive regions are the purplish color. If we compare that to a circumcised penis, what you see is we've removed most of the most sensitive areas and left just this region around the scar, and the remainder of the frenulum is really where most men who are sensitive. And so you can compare them this way. But you don't have to believe me. If you can find a friend or two, maybe one who's circumcised and one who's not, and you can, or maybe yourself, you can look and see where the sensitivity actually lies. And for most men, it is in this region of the frenulum or the scar remnant.
Now, reality can often be quite discomforting, and this is a prime example. So let me clear up the misconceptions. The average male foreskin on the adult male is 12 to 15 square inches. The average adult foreskin. Now, it may not surprise you at this point, but I actually happen to have one here with me. No, I'm just kidding. I'm not getting paid enough. I keep my foreskin where all normal people keep them. In my pocket. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the size of the average male foreskin. Mine would be much bigger. Now, this foreskin sculpture was created only a few years ago by the brilliant artist Vincenzo Aiello, who is actually joining us here today. It's called Hufo, Human Foreskin, a hyper-realistic art sculpture. Now, if we take a look at how it actually works on an anatomical level, what we can see is the foreskin is composed of 4 major parts. So we have the outer foreskin, which is just a continuation of the shaft skin, which keeps the glands sensitive throughout life. We have the inner foreskin, similar to the inner mucosal tissue of your mouth or the female genitalia. We have the frenulum, which is a highly erogenous tethering structure, which anchors a moving body part, the foreskin, to a non-moving body part, the shaft. And then we have the ridged band, also known as the lips of the foreskin. Because like the lips of the face, the lips of the foreskin provide transition from skin to inner mucosa. And like the lips of the face, the lips of the foreskin are densely innervated, with approximately 10 to 20,000 fine touch nerve endings, also making this known as the male G-spot. Ever wonder why ribbed condoms exist? They are trying to recreate what every man comes with, standard issue. The intact penis is far superior at stimulating the female than the circumcised one. Now, damaging female sexuality was also a motivation of the architects of circumcision. As Rabbi Isaac ben Yedeya explains, she too will court the man who is uncircumcised in the flesh and lie against his breast with great passion. For he thrusts inside her a long time because of his foreskin, which acts as a barrier against ejaculation in intercourse. Thus she feels pleasure and reaches an orgasm first. But when a circumcised man desires the beauty of a woman, he will find himself performing his task quickly, emitting his seed as soon as he inserts his crown. As soon as he begins intercourse, he immediately comes to a climax. She has no pleasure from him when she lies down. Bro. Now remember, this was an argument in favor of circumcision. Because rabbis didn't only want to damage their men's sexuality, but they wanted to make sure that their women weren't sexually fulfilled either. Now, Rabbi Yedeya's claim is actually supported by recent studies in the medical literature. For example, what we can see is, with their circumcised partners, women were more likely not to have a vaginal orgasm. And if we take a look at the actual numbers, percent likelihood of vaginal orgasm, what we can see is circumcised men brought their female partners to orgasm about 35% of the time, and intact men 60%. Now those numbers in parentheses are standard deviations, and they're quite large because every man uses his penis differently. But if we extrapolate the results of this methodologically sound study, what we can conclude is male circumcision has robbed American women of about half of all of their vaginal orgasms. Now this is a staggering loss for American women. I am sorry that male circumcision has profoundly harmed you in this way as well.
Oh, there have been a lot of studies on sensitivity. That goes back to Masters and Johnson way back in the 60s. So sensitivity, the great majority, I don't know of any studies that showed any significant difference.
There are plenty of studies that claim otherwise, that claim that men who are intact and men who are circumcised have the same sexual sensation. But every one of those other studies, including the famous one, Masters and Johnson, tested only the glands the little fireman's had at the end of the man's penis for its sensitivity, and actually the glands has very little in the way of sensitivity.
It was amazing to me that these researchers wouldn't understand that. When the question came up, why didn't you test the foreskin? Well, it wouldn't have been fair because the other guys didn't have one. Wait a second, if you're testing sensitivity, isn't that what you're trying to find out? The minute you test the foreskin with its 20,000 to 100,000 nerve endings, you know that it's going to be more sensitive.
It's actually the foreskin that is the male's main erogenous zone, and foreshortening it or getting rid of it definitely affects the male's sexual sensation.
If you ask a man, a circumcised man, where the most sensitive part of his penis is, the absolute most exquisitely sensitive part, it is where the frenulum, or frenum, it's both names, was attached, the little vertical thing that comes down from the opening. Well, that's where the foreskin was removed. That's a hint for men about what they've lost.
Now, the reason why the frenulum is capable of orgasm is that it has thousands and thousands of these nerves called Meissner's corpuscles. These are fine touch nerves. If you take your fingers and run them over the back of your hand,
you can feel it, but it's not terribly pleasurable. You can feel the sense of touch. However, if you stroke your palm of your hand, it kind of tickles a little bit and it feels a little bit better.
Because there's a high concentration of Meissner's corpuscles there. These are fine touch nerves. So what's interesting about them is the lighter you touch them, the more sensation you get from them. If you just run your fingers firmly over your hand, you won't feel much. But if you go very lightly, you'll actually feel that tickle. That's the Meissner's corpuscles.
But it's not just about sensation. The foreskin allows the penis to glide in and out of itself in a way that minimizes friction. So it decreases drying during intercourse, and it decreases friction for both the man and his partner. So by removing this part of the penis, we've rendered a structure that was meant to have moving parts to being just a static structure.
For an intact male, all those nerve endings are stimulated as they cross over the glands, and then the foreskin is everting. As with withdrawal, the same thing happens. For a circumcised male, without having the foreskin, he needs his long strokes. With an intact man, just needs small strokes. He's stimulating himself, he's being stimulated by the female, and the two work together. The long strokes take a man's body away from a woman's body. So she too is struggling. When we have altered our genitals, we have to alter the mechanics of sex to compensate.
Now, there's an entire body of scientific literature that shows that amputating large functional part of your sex organ results in a variety of sexual difficulties. Obviously. This is fucking obvious. Here's just another example. Circumcision was associated with frequent orgasm difficulties in men and a range of frequent sexual difficulties in women. Now remember, despite our fancy clothes and venues, we are all still animals. And if you damage an animal's reproductive and bonding organ, you will damage how it reproduces and bonds. We've even done rat studies on this. Removal of the penile sheath virtually eliminates penile reflexes and decreases copulatory effectiveness. I don't know who did that study, but... But removing functional sex organs necessarily leaves you with sexual dysfunction. Now, here's a personal question. Have any of you ever come too soon in intercourse? Show of hands. Nobody! Damn, I'm the only one! Well, I have. I have in like the last 12 hours. Brittany complains about it all the time. What's so funny? What's so funny? It's not like she's perfect either. She doesn't even clean up afterwards. It's like living with a petri dish. What? What? It's not like I'm the only one. Any of you have circumcised partners who've ever come too soon in intercourse? She has. Maybe it's because we've had a big part of our penis that regulates the ejaculatory response stolen from us. It's just this wild theory I have. Mission accomplished, Rabbi. Now, it's a great picture of Brittany eye, isn't it? Now, I realize how this is not immediately obvious, how this butterfly shape is a foreskin. So if we take a look at this composite, what we can see is that the foreskin is a bilayer tissue that wraps around the head of a circumcised penis until we have what we would recognize as an uncircumcised or intact penis. Now, these are just a snapshot of the functions of the foreskin. I have actually compiled a comprehensive list, if you can believe. And I have broken them down into sexual, protective, and other functions. Now look how massive the average male foreskin is. Look how massive it is. Could you imagine how big mine would be? But seriously, could you imagine saying that this massive part of the penis with 20 compelling sexual functions is unimportant? It is massively important. It is massively important. And everybody knew it was important. That is why they removed it. So, if you were circumcised at birth, you were condemned to a life of a devastating sensory deficit, as you lose most of your nerve endings, including your male G-spot. But it gets worse. See, once this tissue is removed, your penis undergoes a process called keratinization, where the protein keratin, the same protein that makes up your hair and nails and rhinoceros horns covers the remaining minority of sensory tissue on the penis. So if we take a look at an intact penis, what we can see is the glands are soft, sensitive, kept that way by the protective foreskin, retracted in this picture. Or if we contrast that with a circumcised penis, not only is it missing most of its sensory tissue because the foreskin is removed, but the remaining minority is covered in this protein callus, which even further desensitizes sex. Circumcision removes almost the entirety of sexual experience for men. It is a profoundly evil thing to do to a human being. Now, just as you can never fully appreciate a kiss if you have your lips amputated, so too can you never fully appreciate the essential human experience of making love if you have your foreskin amputated. Now, this is a profound loss. This is a loss of your humanity. It changes your worldview. And that is why I'm so passionate about this issue, because it is a radical violation of an individual's fundamental human rights.
So let's hear from an obstetrician how they frame these sort of things. This is Lisa Masterson being interviewed on the Craig Ferguson Late Late Show.
Yeah, and again, you know, but that's a personal choice. And I talk to my patients as an obstetrician, I talk to my patients a lot about this. And really, there's a lot of health benefits and some risk benefits, but it's really a social procedure. So you really have to decide, do you want your son to look like you? Do you know, is it a cultural thing? Is it a social thing? It's absolutely, and there's some health benefits, more for the lady than the man, but as far as decreasing STDs and passing on to, you know, other women, HPV, which can cause cervical cancer, so decreasing STDs and cancers, all that good stuff.
But couldn't you achieve the same effect by washing your pee-pee on a regular basis?
You absolutely could. And
So we're talking, you can have this chopped off or you can wash it. Your call.
Exactly.
That's a tough choice there, Doctor. I know.
So obviously I appreciate Craig's point of view there. Now he's from Scotland. Coincidentally, they don't do this to children. But think about her discourse. She's saying you have to choose as a parent. It's like this, and I want to question that framing of it. Like, do you have to choose other body modification options for your child? Like a nose job or things like that? And if the idea of, you know, doing things to our children because we want them to look a certain way chills you, I'm glad. I want it to chill us. I want us to wonder, why are we so busy making our children look like what we think boys and girls should look like? In this case, we have this idea boys should look a certain way in their genitals. Okay, so the last section is how do we get practitioners doing this? So I have a few quotes here from practitioners who stopped doing it, like Marilyn Milos, a nurse, who after seeing it refused to assist with them and was fired for telling parents they don't need to do it. Michelle Storms, who's a very well-known obstetrician, who said she was ridiculed and patronized after stopping them in 1988. And I'm at Georgetown, so I went and talked to the head of obstetrics at Georgetown University Hospital. Obstetricians do most of them. And she says, medically, it doesn't make sense. I don't even like doing the procedure, but I do it well. I perform thousands of circumcisions. She was clear that it's a social procedure. She was clear that it doesn't make sense medically. And she told me in our conversation that she would not stop doing them.
Now, what we have here is, wrapping this whole thing together, is we have a history of a small group of powerful and well-placed sexually violent ideologues, or ideological fanatics, who, despite global condemnation, have censored the functions of the foreskin by creating a nonsensical recommendation which they have turned into an obfuscating lie, which they then peddle to a complicit and strangely ideologically homogenous U.S. media, who I'm sure is going to love me, who disseminates widespread information, creating this vicious, fraudulent U.S. echo chamber. It's all a lie! It's all a lie, guys. 100% of it is a lie. Circumcision is a disgusting lie. Why? Why would they do such a thing? I don't know. I have a few ideas. Maybe because they have damaged in the most sexually violent and fundamental of ways for life over 120 million men in this country. Do you understand the medical liability on that? It is in the trillions and trillions of dollars. Or maybe because they have raped American men of over 1 trillion erogenous nerve endings. Do you understand the pleasure potential that has been lost? And what's it replaced with? It's replaced with rage. And that rage is embedded in our culture. Don't you see it? I do.
New at 11, supporters of a circumcision ban in San Francisco have gathered enough signatures to put that measure on the ballot in November.
Lloyd Schofield is the man behind the ballot measure.
Before this initiative, did you have any background in politics or community organizing?
No. No, I didn't.
People have tried to prevent Jews from practicing our religion. And circumcision is a fundamental, integral piece of our practice.
Our chief opponent was Abby Michelson-Porth of the Jewish Community Relations Council. She had a lot of connections. She had a lot of power and money behind her. I did have a couple of cordial conversations with her. We were talking about a baby boy who died from his circumcision. She said, "Oh, well, he died of anesthesia." I said, well, if he hadn't been circumcised, he wouldn't be given the anesthesia and he would not have died. So I said, don't you believe babies should be given anesthesia when they go through this very, very painful procedure? And she said, no, that's my religion. So I said, I guess we don't have anything else to talk about. And that was the last I spoke with her. What happened was they took us to Superior Court to have the ballot initiative removed on a technicality.
I think that if this law had a religious exemption, it would not have roused the sleeping lion of people, even though they're a tiny percentage of the population, who are strongly opposed to any sort of regulation of their religious beliefs or practices.
Many religious activists said, you know, this isn't going to go through unless there's a religious exception. I said, no, we can't do that. It's too late anyway. And I would not have put my name on it. That is anti-Semitic, is to say Jewish children do not deserve the same protections as everybody else.
But now one of the campaign tactics that the backers are using is generating outrage in the Jewish community.
It's an internet comic called Foreskin Man.
This did a lot of damage to the anti-circumcision cause.
Critics say this comic strip is blatantly anti-Semitic. Abby Porth showed us comparisons of Foreskin Man and images the Nazis used.
I went on TV, I said, this is one person, he's not a member of our committee. That was what our opposition was looking for, and they used it very effectively. We really wanted to have a discussion, and this gave our opponents the excuse they needed to not have any discussion.
Circumcision is still thought of as a Jewish practice, so there's always that idea that if you are opposed to circumcision, what this really is a hidden form of anti-Semitism.
Where it really is coming from is that people care about the welfare of babies, and people care about the welfare of Jewish babies. There is criticism of circumcision within the Jewish community. I'm an example of that. And there are many other examples of that.
My father was a rabbi, so I grew up in the Jewish tradition. This wasn't done for my own good. This was not my religious choice to do.
I was circumcised on the 8th day of life in a ritual circumcision.
What sort of feelings came up when you were initially learning this?
Rage. Absolute rage.
If Jews respond to circumcision critics with a charge that they're being anti-Semitic, this is a way of avoiding the merits of the issue.
Well, this is an ad hominem attack. That means you attack the man instead of the argument, and that way you can shift the discussion. So I'm going to steal the argument and the debate back from the people that want to talk about anti-Semites, and I want to go back to babies and why babies have rights. The baby's religious rights means that you cannot cut his body, because he too actually is born with religious freedom.
Circumcising someone is a violation of that person's religious freedom, that they may grow up and decide to not be Jewish, but now that their body's been marked it's too late for them.
And nowadays you have Jewish families who are practicing Brit Shalom.
Brit Shalom is nothing more than a covenantal naming ceremony without circumcision. Although most think in order to be Jewish, you got to be circumcised. Jewish identity is purely matrilineal. In other words, you don't have to be circumcised to be Jewish.
There's definitely not one thought on this within Judaism, and I certainly don't want the Anti-Defamation League speaking for me. I felt that being Jewish, it was really important that I protest as a Jew. A rabbi came up to me and told me that I was doing the right thing, fighting for change.
Anytime that I am at a circumcision, right, all the feelings that you're concretizing in this are there. People know something's off, and once you see it, you can't go back.
I can't go back. And
is.
for me, it was added baggage that this is so ingrained in the culture that I came from.
Understand, we're forcing people, we may legislate people into very significant cultural, psychological loss. Now,
I understand.
not equal to it, because one is symbolic. I get it, and one is real. So I'm trying to say it both, you know, I hope you're hearing it.
I'm hearing it. You're doing a wonderful, an amazing job at it.
You know it's going to...
Someone said to me that...
Human rights are irrepressible.
I've had some interesting conversations with him. He's encouraged me to speak from my heart without hate. So, in some way, he's sitting here with me as I'm talking now, because I can get really angry about this subject.
So what was the ruling? Very unfortunate, and it has been stricken from the election cycle. We were pulled off the ballot so people would not get a chance to vote on it or discuss it. This is a long battle. Marilyn Milos here has devoted her life to protecting infants from this, and we are going to carry forward with all of the work she's done and add to it and expand.
It permeates so much of our culture, and we don't talk about it. It's very painful to work on this issue in that environment, in an environment where we joke about the feelings of men who are being vocal about their displeasure. And you know, you'll hear someone say, well, they're in the fringe. You know, the majority of guys are fine with this. So those who speak out get blasted, and those who don't suffer in silence and potentially perpetrate the same horrific act on their own children. So the cycle continues.
What would you say to men who are angry that they were circumcised?
Yeah.
I'm just curious.
What do I say? I'd say, get a life. I'd say, come on. I mean, there's 120 million males in this country that have been circumcised and are perfectly fine. Go find another reason for your problems. That's what I tell them.
3 of my sons suffered torture and mutilation because some doctor lied to me. If I stop doing this work, oh, I'm going to cry. If I stop doing this work, I think about my babies on that board. So, how do you apologize to children for doing this? How could you possibly say enough I'm sorry's? You can't. So I do the work, and in that is the healing. I don't know. It's not healing. You don't get over this. You don't get over it. But you can make a difference. I mean, to stop for a second with this. I didn't start out as a crusader or as an intactivist. I just started out thinking I was going to hold the light and everybody would say, oh, good, we don't have to do it. I had no idea the emotional attachment people have, even to something so sick. Somebody said to me, why you? And I said, because I heard the scream of the baby. He said, do you know how many millions of people have heard that scream? I said, well, then the question is, why not them? Why did it take till me? You know, why didn't everybody stand up and scream?
Real social change isn't doing something grandiose. Real social change is going out and changing people's minds. I've seen my friends' ideas spread throughout the population. When I first got into it, we were still a fringe movement, and now it's everywhere. And it all started out with a handful of people just going out there and passionately speaking.
This is a huge activist cause,
And we will win. We are winning. This is the human rights issue of the 21st century, the American human rights issue. The way we treat our baby boys is kind of the last stand here. Our culture is shaped by what we do to boys, affected by it forever. Ultimately, we'll look back and we'll say, we used to do that. And I look forward to that day.